Alright guys, so today we're going to talk a little bit about classical conditioning. Now classical conditioning is a type of learning in which we link two or more stimuli. Now that's very vague, but it'll become more clear later. So this laid the foundation for John Watson's behaviorism. Behaviorism thought that psychology should be an objective science and that behavior is more important than mental process. We shouldn't even look at mental process. Now, most psychologists would agree with the first part that psychology should be an objective science, but not so much that we should take out mental processes. But we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of this lesson. Now, I'm pretty sure we've all heard of Ivan Pavlov, probably rings a bell or two. He did the classic study in which he paired a tone with food so that the dog would start salivating at the sound of the tone without the presentation of the food. So Ivan Pavlov originally was studying dogs' digestive systems, and he led to this because he found that the dogs would start salivating not only when they had the food in their mouth, but even when at the sight of their food or the sight of the person who was bringing their food, and even the footsteps of the person who was bringing their food. So he decided to design an experiment. In this experiment, he had the dog secluded in a room, was in a harness, and was measuring the saliva that was coming out of his mouth. And so Pavlov paired this tone with the food. So now we need to learn a few words, but to do that, we're going to draw a little. So before conditioning, we go like this. The dog would eat the food, and the dog would salivate. Very basic. So before it is conditioned, the food is what's known as an unconditioned stimulus. Now, an unconditioned stimulus is a unconditioned stimulus is a naturally and automatically triggers a response. So our saliva would be that unconditioned response. So these are both unconditioned. So the unconditioned stimulus, food, naturally would produce an unconditioned response, which is to salivate. The dogs didn't have to learn that whenever they had food in their mouth, they should salivate. It was natural. That's why these are both unconditioned. This happens naturally without any prior learning. Now, at this point, before any conditioning takes place, if we were to play a tone, which at this point, because it has not been conditioned, this tone is called a neutral stimulus. It's neutral because it doesn't lead to anything. You can play a tone for a dog if you haven't done anything all day and you won't salivate. So what would happen before we condition? Exactly, nothing. Nothing, no salivation, nothing. So the process of conditioning would look like this. So you would play the tone for the dog, which at this point is still a neutral stimulus, and right afterwards you would present the food, which is also still our unconditioned stimulus, which would lead to salivation, which is still an unconditioned response. Now, after several repetitions of tone, food, saliva, tone, food, saliva, you get to a point where the dog learns that once he has that tone, he should salivate because food is coming. So at this point, rather than it being a neutral stimulus, it is now a conditioned stimulus. And saliva, rather than an unconditioned response, is now a conditioned response whenever it is paired with a tone. So we go from unconditioned, naturally happening, to pairing it with something neutral till we get a conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response. The dogs have learned that when they hear that tone, their body's going to start salivating because food is on its way. Does that make sense? Yes, kind of, little. Any questions? All right, well, why don't we do another example? So I'm pretty sure most of us have been to the eye doctor. And I don't know about you, but I hate that little machine that puffs in your eye. It drives me crazy. So let's just say you're part of an experiment, and the experimenter sounds a tone just before delivering that puff of air into your eye. And you start blinking, of course. And lo and behold, after several repetitions of this, tone, puff, blink, you start blinking whenever you hear the tone. Right? So let's kind of go through this exactly like we did with the food. So we get a tone. Oops, not a tone, excuse me. We get the air puff, and that leads us to blink. So what is the unconditioned stimulus and what is the unconditioned response? Exactly. So the air puff is the unconditioned stimulus. You didn't have to learn that whenever we get air in our eyes to blink. So that would make the blinking exactly the unconditioned response. Now, what would the tone be in this example? Exactly, the neutral stimulus. Now it's only the neutral stimulus before we have been conditioned to blink with it. But before this is paired with the air puff, it is a neutral stimulus. Good. So let's say we've done the pairing. So we've done the tone plus the air puff, that leads us to blink. So now we have this relationship. The tone plays and we blink without a puff of air. So what is the tone now after this relationship has been conditioned? Exactly, the conditioned stimulus. And what's the blinking with the tone? Exactly, a conditioned response. Does that make sense? All right, good. So Pavlov didn't spend all his life just doing basic things with the dog. Well, he did most of it, but he also looked at other processes in conditioning, specifically acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, and discrimination. We're going to go through these each one by one. So acquisition. So this is the initial part of learning the association between, let's just say, the tone and the blinking. So that would be the initial tone plus air puff plus leading, to blinking. So he wanted to know how long between this neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus should he wait. And he found not much time at all, about half a second. So I have a question. So what do you think would happen in this example if we reversed it? So instead of doing tone, air puff, that equals blink, we would do air puff, tone, and of course, because of this, we would blink. What do you think would happen? Or even in the dog example, if they would give the dog his food, then play the tone, what would happen? Nothing, exactly. This is a biological relationship. It's adaptive. So if the tone was afterwards, we wouldn't link it with anything because honestly, this isn't like we probably would have blinked before we even heard the tone. We wouldn't even pay any attention. So its classical condition is adaptive because it helps humans, animals prepare for either good or bad events. For instance, a deer hearing the snapping of a twig and may to that deer signal that there's a predator about. And he's learned that relationship and it helps him survive because he knows something bad's happening and he should probably run away. So we're going to do one more of these relationships kind of in the middle here. So just to make sure we really get it. So in the book, it mentions a psychologist who was dating a girl who liked to eat onions a lot and always had onion breath. To most people, not arousing, but to the psychologist, after a while, he would smell the onions, he would kiss her, he'd become aroused. So to him, eventually, onion breath became arousing. So the original relationship would look like this. I'm going to put it all on the board and see if we can label it. So kissing leads to arousal. Then you have onion breath plus kissing equals arousal. And finally, you get onion breath equals arousal. Alright, so let's start labeling things. So this is before conditioning, this is during, this is after. So before conditioning, what is kissing? That leads to arousal. Exactly, an unconditioned stimulus. And the arousal? Correct, an unconditioned response. You didn't have to learn that kissing leads to arousal. So during conditioning, what is onion breath? Exactly, neutral stimulus. At this point, it's just onion breath. It doesn't mean anything. How about kissing? Exactly, it's still unconditioned stimulus, and arousal is still an unconditioned response. But after conditioning, now what is onion breath? Exactly, a conditioned stimulus. And arousal, a conditioned response. So he learned that onion breath would lead to arousal for him. So what would happen if after this conditioning they broke up? So now onion breath, no, I crossed off the wrong thing. Onion breath does not lead to kissing, which leads to arousal. So now he has onion breath and leads to nothing. Exactly, after a while, this relationship would stop happening because it never leads to kissing. So this is what the process is called extinction. So it's diminishing of conditioned responses. So Pavlov found when he would do this with his dogs, he was very scientific. He would measure the saliva. So say, whenever he conditioned him, he would have 5 milliliters of saliva. But during extinction, he would present the tone and not give the food. And so after a while, the dog stopped salivating whenever the tone played. But he noticed if he waited an hour and came back and played the tone again, the dogs would have what's called spontaneous recovery, so the reappearance of a conditioned response. But it would be severely weakened. So, for instance, instead of 5 milliliters, it would only be maybe 2 or 3. So this suggested to Pavlov that the connection was suppressed rather than completely eliminated. Next, we're going on to generalization. So Pavlov found that he could change the pitch of the tone or the sound he played, and the dogs would still salivate. Not quite as much as the tone they had been learning the entire time, but they would still produce a response. It's the same thing with the dogs. He had learned that, if you get your leg rubbed, you salivate. If you scratched their leg or patted their leg, they would still salivate. Not as much again, but they would still have that response. Now, this is also an adaptive response. For instance, if you have a toddler who is afraid of moving cars, he or she might generalize that to trucks and motorcycles, which can be very good because you don't want your toddler running out in the street in front of a semi. Now, this has been seen in labs and in real life where children have been compared with non-abused children. And so, for instance, when a face that had been conditioned to dislike is morphed into another face, we have the tendency to dislike vaguely similar more faces than ones that are severely different. Now, on the flip side of generalization, we also have what's called discrimination. Now, this is distinguishing between a conditioned stimulus and a very similar stimulus. So, for instance, you might be, or at least I am, afraid of a guard dog, big vicious dog. But you might feel perfectly safe around a guide dog. And again, this is biologically adaptive. Any questions so far? No? So what does this all mean? And what's Pavlov's legacy? So classical conditioning is just a way that virtually all organisms can learn to adapt to their environments. They've seen these type of relationships can be created with worms, fish, dogs, monkeys, obviously humans. And it also showed, the big one at that time, that processes such as learning can be studied objectively. So, as a couple of examples, applications of classical conditioning, for instance, drug cravings. So many people who use drugs crave it more when they're around people or places that they usually use at. For instance, I was actually lucky enough to do my internship at the Behavioral Center at Renaissance, and whenever I had a drug user who was worried about this going home, that they would start using again, I would tell them that whoever they were going home with, to call them early and tell them, hey, you know, get rid of my pipes, get rid of my lighters, needles, whatever, throw them away, so when I get home, I don't have to look at that and I won't have that response, that stimulus, that conditioned stimulus leading to an unfortunate conditioned response of using drugs. They also found it's useful in immune responses. So we can condition the body that if you, for instance, take a certain drug that affects your immune system and you pair it with a flavor or a taste, after a while, even having that taste in your mouth can evoke a response to your immune system. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the class, Pavlov laid the foundation for Watson's behaviorism. So Watson believed that, again, as I said earlier, that psychology should just be behavior. You should just look at behavior. It doesn't matter what you think, but how you act. Has anyone ever heard of Baby Albert? Yes? A couple people? So Baby Albert was an experiment. So Watson took a baby, Albert, and he would show him a little white mouse. And just as Albert would reach to touch him, his assistant had a metal can of some sort, a metal gong, and would hit it with a hammer, boom, right behind Baby Albert. And so Baby Albert would obviously start to cry, since that's one of the few things we're afraid of when we're born, is loud sounds. And so they did this a few times till, I believe they said 7 actually, till at the end they would show Baby Albert the white mouse and he would start crying without the gong. And furthermore, they generalized, so they could show him a white rabbit and he would start crying, or a white dog. And I think at the end they even did a piece of white fur and Baby Albert would just start bawling. Now, while interesting as this experiment was, what's the problem with this? Exactly, it is incredibly unethical to make a small child incredibly afraid of white objects or white animals. By today's standard, you would not be allowed to do that experiment. But the experiment did have an interesting result. It led psychologists to wonder, are we just a bundle of conditioned stimulus and conditioned responses? Or conditioned emotions? And if so, what does that mean? Can we change who we are through extinction and classical conditioning? Food for thought. Any more questions, guys? All right. Well, thank you. I'll see you guys next class.